Hi there, I'm Dr. Koenig, and this is a quick video tutorial on multiplying and dividing integers. If you haven't yet, you should start with two of my prior videos that kind of connect to this material. The first was on adding integers and the second on subtracting integers. I'll link them here to this video if you need them. Those are a great place to get started in your integer work. However, if you're already familiar with addition and subtraction with positives and negatives, feel free to jump right into this video. Let's go. Now let's start with something you're super familiar with, regular multiplication. And let's go back to when you first learned it in second grade, third grade, whenever that was. When you learn multiplication, you learn it as repeated addition, and that's helpful with integers too. So for example, when you learn a problem like this, 3 times 4, you often hear that this means 3 groups of 4. Now 3 groups of 4 would mean I have 4 plus another 4 plus another 4, which as we know is 12. Integer multiplication is very, very similar. Here's an example of the exact same thing, only I've changed that 4 to a negative 4. We're still going to be looking at 3 groups, but this time, obviously, you can see that we're looking at 3 groups of negative 4 this time. Now, when I write that out, that means I've got negative 4 plus negative 4 plus negative 4, and we know that when we're adding all 3 negatives, we just add the 4's together and keep the negative. Our answer is negative 12. What I'm noticing when I look at this problem is that a positive times a negative came out with a negative answer. Let's take a look at some more and see if that always happens. Now here I have a bunch of problems for you because I wanted you to see different iterations of the same process. So let's start with 5 times negative 4. Again, let's think of our basic multiplication understanding in that we're looking at 5 groups of negative 4. If I were to write that out, I'd have 5 negative 4's. And just like when we were adding integers, if we're adding a bunch of negatives, there are no positives in this mix, that means I can just add the numbers together and know that my answer will come out negative. In this case, 5 4's is 20. And I know my answer will come out to negative 20 because I'm adding a bunch of negative 4's. The second problem is a little bit different, but only in the order that the numbers showed up. The negative showed up first, the positive showed up second. Now, multiplication has this lovely property called the commutative property, and that property means I can take these numbers and flip them around. I can rewrite this as 8 groups of negative 3 instead of negative 3 groups of 8, which might make less sense. The goal there is to not change the value. So the 8 has not changed from a positive 8. The negative 3 has not changed from a negative 3. We're still multiplying. We just changed the order that those problems showed up in. Now again, I want to think about my repeated addition. This problem tells me that I have 8 groups of negative 3. And if I think about my repeated addition, even if I didn't write them all out, I know that I'm adding a whole bunch of negatives, which means I can add 8 3's. And I know that because I'm adding 8 negative 3's, I'll get a negative answer. Now, 8 3's is 24, so my answer is, of course, negative 24. Again, I'm noticing a pattern. When I multiplied a positive times a negative, and even when I wrote it all out, I ended up with a negative answer. Same thing here, positive times negative, negative answer. Now, once you notice that pattern, the math becomes quite a bit easier. So I can look at a problem like negative 7 times 2, and I can know that my answer should come out negative. In that way, I've simplified the problem. What I'm really multiplying is 7 times 2, which is 14, but I know that a negative times a positive is a negative, giving me negative 14. Likewise, when I'm multiplying 9 times negative 9, what I'm really multiplying is 9 times 9, which is 81, but I know that a positive times a negative is a negative. Now, this is an important rule for you to understand, so I would highly suggest writing this in a notebook. Anytime you're multiplying a positive by a negative, you'll get a negative answer. Once you know that fact, multiplication with integers becomes a lot easier. The tricky part here is we've talked about positive times positive since second grade, since third grade, whenever that is. Now we've introduced positive times negative, but what is a negative times a negative? Let's look at something that can kind of show us a pattern and lead us in the right direction. Now here I have a bunch of problems. You should notice they're really similar, except this first number is decreasing by 1. That's important to notice because we're going to set up a pattern that will help us figure out that bottom problem, -1 times -2. Now, going back, we now know that a positive times a negative is a negative. So when I multiply 3 times -2, I know I'm going to get a negative answer, and 3 times 2 is 6. Same thing goes for 2 times -2. I know I'll get a negative answer, and 2 times 2 is 4. Same thing for 1 times -2. Of course, 1 times anything is itself. But, again, I've got a positive times a negative, so I know I'll get a negative. 1 times 2 is 2. 0 times anything, of course, is 0. Now, what we're looking for here is a pattern, and hopefully you're already seeing it. We went from -6 to -4, that's increasing by 2. -4 to -2, that's increasing by 2. -2 to 0, that's an increase of 2. If I increase by 2 again, where would I end up? That's right, I'd end up at +2. Now what that tells me is that a negative times a negative comes out positive. What a strange thing. Now one way to think about that, why that happens, why would a negative times a positive become a negative, is to rewrite this problem with a negative out front and some brackets. Now, a negative can be thought of as the opposite. So I encourage you to think of a negative as an opposite. It's an opposite of a positive. It's an additive inverse of a positive. So if I think of that as an opposite, this problem might make a little more sense. 1 times -2 inside those brackets I know is -2, but that extra negative is telling me to find the opposite of -2, which of course is 2. What that tells me is a negative times a negative must be a positive. Now here's a little word trick that somebody taught me years ago. I can't lay credit to it, but PNN is a quick and easy way to remember when you're multiplying a positive and a negative or a negative and a negative, what the answer should be. Here's how it works. If I'm multiplying, as I am here, a negative times a positive, I can look at what I'm multiplying, and whatever's left over is what my answer should be. A positive times a negative gives me a negative, so I know my answer will be -20. In the same way, if I am multiplying a negative times a negative, let me get rid of my boxes. -10 times -8 gives me a positive solution, +80. PNN is a cute little way to remember what a positive times a negative is. You just look for the two things you're multiplying, and whatever letter is left over, that's what your answer will be. Now we get to division, and I recognize that division could be a little intimidating. We just learned 2 new rules for multiplication, for positive and negative and negative and negative. We learned this abbreviation PNN that can help. What's wonderful about division is that it follows the exact same rules as multiplication. So once you know the rules, you can do either operation and do it correctly. So let's start with 16 divided by -4. Now, I'm going to go to my PNN example, and I can see that I'm multiplying a positive times a negative, so I circle positive times negative, and what's left over is negative. That means my answer will be negative. Then I can just divide 16 by 4, and I'll get 4. -4 is my solution. -25 divided by -5 is 2 negatives, so I'll circle my 2 negatives, and that tells me that the letter left over, that P, is for positive. My answer will be positive. In this case, 25 divided by 5 is 5, so my answer to this problem is +5. One last one, 49 divided by -7. Again, I'm going to write out my PNN. Positive divided by negative is negative. So I know my answer will be negative, and 49 divided by 7 is 7. Now the big overview is your operation, right? Your multiplication and your division. If you're multiplying or dividing a positive and a negative, your answer will be negative. If instead you're multiplying or dividing a negative and a negative, your answer will be positive. What I would caution you about is saying that 2 negatives always make a positive. That's great if you're multiplying or dividing, but it's not true when you're adding and subtracting. So something to be careful about is what you talk about. When you say that two negatives always make a positive, that's only specific to multiplication and division. So I hope this helped you better understand how to multiply and divide integers. Hopefully you are now comfortable with adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. Again, check out my other videos if you need more help. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for being here.